I'm delighted to introduce a distinguished scholar and a great friend, Professor Ben Tonra. Ben is Professor of International Relations at University College Dublin in Ireland, and he's the recipient of the UAC's Lifetime Achievement Award 2023, right? University Association for European Studies. Professor Tonra has published extensively about European foreign security and defense policy, about Ireland and the European Union, the role of small states like Ireland in the European Union, and about international relations theory. And I thought I can start by asking you a kind of basic question from an international relations perspective. Is the European Union a credible global actor?
Thanks, Stefan. Lovely to talk to you. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in the word credibility. I think the European Union is inevitably a global actor simply by virtue of its size, its weight, its significance, particularly in the economic, regulatory, and trade fields. I think what the Union struggles with is to try to define itself as a global actor in terms as people commonly understand it. And I think there's a, if you forgive my using the word, there's an ontological issue for the European Union, being neither a nation state in and of itself, or indeed a nation state in the making, nor a traditional international organization. It's a very unique political construction. And so it struggles really to define what it is, what its purposes are, and what its objectives are. On top of that, of course, the Union is not the Union. The Union is an assembly of 27 sovereign member states. And one of the real challenges I think the Union has faced over time has been to bring together the national interests, value sets, respect for history and geography, which is so important to nation states, and to craft that into a coherent strategy for the Union as a whole. So you still have a situation, I think, where member states of the European Union in Central and Eastern Europe have a very different understanding of the world, the threats that they face, and what they need to do to face those threats than, say, for example, states who face onto the Mediterranean. And what the Union has tried to do is try to craft a foreign policy which encompasses all of that and tries to give it strategic direction. And I think that's where the Union falls down in a sense, and that is setting a list of priorities for its foreign policy and pursuing those priorities with a coherence and with the traditional tools of foreign policy.
So we cover actually quite a bit of this discussion about what the European Union is. I interviewed a couple of fellow scholars asking that question, but the question that arises for an EU as a foreign policy actor is also about geography, right? How far does the EU reach? How does it meant to engage? How does it engage with its neighborhood? And I found an old article you published many years ago about the European Union's near abroad under the title Fuzzy Politics Around Fuzzy Borders. And I thought I could ask you then, where are the borders of the EU? And is that concept of fuzzy borders, if you want to explain it, is it still useful?
I think it's still useful. I think primarily in the trade and economic sphere. I mean, we have a lot of colleagues who work on sort of the regulatory power of the European Union. You take something like GDPR, this is the data protection legislation of the European Union. Many states overseas have simply adopted the principles of GDPR so they can fit in to the regulatory framework that the European Union has set. And again, simply by virtue of its size, wealth, and power, the Union has that capacity to in a sense stretch its borders beyond its physical geographic limits. I think the point you make about geography is very important. As I say, that refers back to my earlier point about different strategic understandings of the world coming from different member states depending on their geography. I think for me, though, even more important than geography is the history. So that when you think of the European Union's borders, both its political borders, its foreign policy borders, its value borders, you have so many member states with quite deep, long, and often brutal colonial histories that, you look at regions of the world like North Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, where the Union has that history, I think fuzzies the borders even more. Now, then you have the issue of the European Union, and this, we get into more esoteric conversation. We have this notion of the European Union trying to transform the world in its own image. We went through a period of quite hubristic understanding of the European Union as sort of not just a novel political entity, but almost a messianic political entity whose purpose was, as a novel political construction, to reshape the world in its own image. We have the famous example of Josep Borrell talking at the European Diplomatic Academy, describing Europe as the beautiful, fruitful, tended garden, and outside the walls of Europe there was nothing but jungle, and that the role of the European Union was to send out its gardeners into the world to recreate the jungle into a garden. So there is this sense, in terms of this question of borders, that the European Union both has its own fuzzy borders in geographic and historical terms, but it also aims, or has aimed in the past, at extending those borders to encompass the entire world, to, in a sense, take its very particular conception of human values and human rights and transpose those to the rest of the world. And I think that has been a tough process for the European Union, a learning process for the European Union, and one which, in the contested international commons in which we currently live, is even more problematic.
I would like you to unpack that a bit, because this is about soft power Europe, right? For decades, Europeans have prided themselves on their soft power or smart power. And the idea is, of course, that unlike the US that often resorts to military means, Europeans don't even have those means, and therefore, they could not exercise that kind of power. And I have a quote here from a prominent US scholar, Andrew Moravchik, right, who has praised consistently Europe's soft power. He described the European Union as the quiet superpower, writing until very recently, like that quote is from 2020, that Brussels is smarter than Beijing, London, Moscow, and Washington. Is it?
I think that argument had a lot of resonance in terms of the world that was 20 years ago, in the immediate post-Cold War period. Now, listen, a lot of very smart people misjudged what the end of the Cold War meant. We had the end of history. We had the clash of civilizations. We had a lot of very smart people getting things wrong about how the world was going to become after the Cold War. I think in that multilateral environment, I think the European Union had huge benefits. It was almost a poster child for globalization. Had the world taken the turn that many people expected it to, I think the European Union would have considerable soft power, would have been able, through things like GDPR, its market power, its economic power, really would have been able to work in tandem with other global powers to shape the global commons. Now, for all kinds of reasons, which would take several podcasts to go through, the world didn't take that turn, and so I think the European Union is struggling to come to terms with the world as it is, as opposed to the world as it would wish it to be. And in that context, the European Union is struggling with some basic fundamental weaknesses, because, as I say again, it's not a nation state. It doesn't have executive authority. It doesn't have hierarchical power in terms of the deployment of its power, or hierarchical capacity to deploy its power. And it's struggling to meet a very traditional, old-fashioned military threat coming from the Russian Federation. Having said all of that, it is learning quickly. And I think, when you were working, and when we were working together in UCD Dublin, if I had described a situation to you in which the European Union was off buying and designing military weapons and shipping them to a third power to defeat a continental power, I think you would have probably looked at me as if I was mad. So the European Union has come a long way and learns quickly. I mean, that's something I think the Union deserves credit for. It does learn quickly, but it takes time to turn that gargantuan ship that is the Union. Whether it turns in time, for me, is the question. Whether it can accrete to itself the capacity, the power, and the resources to deploy military force in the way that some people expect it to, I have a serious question.
So this reminds me of another quote by Ivan Krastev, this Bulgarian commentator, political scientist, who noted immediately after the invasion of Ukraine in February, immediately after the 24th of February 2022, that we all live in Putin's world now. That this was really a game changer. And I agree. So what you said is, measured against what we know about the EU and its own history, the transformation that the EU has undergone over the last 2 years is phenomenal. But is it all too little too late to actually effectively help Ukraine to stand up against Russia, to push back the invading forces? And that brings me to the question whether the EU needs to become also a military actor, as some people argue, or whether Ukraine is going to tragically be the victim of this in-between status of the European polity.
I think definitively on the question of the in-between status, I think the answer is no, because both NATO and the European Union have now committed themselves to Ukrainian membership. That's not an offer that can be withdrawn, that can be rescinded, so long obviously as Ukraine has its own sovereignty.
Sorry, I should just clarify. Yeah. I don't mean the in-between status of Ukraine, which is tragic also, of course, and the very name Ukraine, if you say the yes. Ukraine is the borderland, right? I meant what you said in response to the very first question, that the European Union is this unique polity. It's not a nation state in the making, nor is it just a collection of nation states. So it is more than that. But in relation to Ukraine, my worry is that whatever the EU is not enough. So the EU and the collective West to some extent has done enough to enable Ukraine to survive, but probably not enough to defeat Russia, basically.
Yeah, I think the key word there is enough, and the question then is enough of what? Because there, I think the issue is that there are some within the European Union, and we've seen, members of the von der Leyen Commission, and we've seen many people outside, talk about the European Union as if they expect it to have the kind of military capacity that the People's Republic of China has, or that the Russian Federation has, or the United States has, and that can then be deployed in support of Ukraine. That, I think, is the problem, because I think that level, those expectations, in my view, are unrealizable. I have said elsewhere, I don't think the constitutional DNA of the European Union supports that vision of the European Union, and I think there's a danger in chasing that vision of the European Union as its own decisive military actor. What the European can do, has done, and should do much, much more of is precisely this notion of supplying weapons and arms to Ukraine in terms of assisting its member states in developing new weapon systems, effective weapon systems that can contribute to NATO's deterrence in Europe, can provide, obviously, as we've seen, basically sustaining the entire Ukrainian economy for these last number of years, because without an economy, the Ukrainian state could not possibly exist. So I think the Union has done a lot, but it can't do some of the things that only the states can do. And there, obviously, we're relying on the United States in particular, but there's also a huge obligation, which they have not yet met, on Germany and on France as nation states to provide Ukraine with the material, with the training, and with the capacity to sustain its own defense. Because again, remember, cast your mind back, within the days of that initial invasion, there were very few people who expected Ukraine to survive.
Yes, yes.
The overwhelming expectation was, it was 2 days, it was 3 days, it was a couple of weeks. The Ukrainians did that by themselves.
Yes.
Nobody was on their side then. Nobody was providing them with what they needed then. They did that by themselves. So what Europe and what the member states of the European Union have to do is to provide Ukraine with the resources it requires and needs for its own defense, which it will execute in its own perspective.
So you talk about the EU's DNA, and one important aspect of the EU's DNA is the principle of solidarity, of course, and that's what we are discussing now in relation to Ukraine. But going back to Ireland, where you are based, and you are from Ireland, and you published on Ireland and the EU, can you elaborate a bit on how the principle of solidarity works in relation to small member states like Ireland?
I think it's absolutely critical. I think here, the institutional role of the Commission, I think, has always been really, really important as a defender of the treaties, as a defender of law, as a defender of equal treatment among the member states. We both know that the entire political system of the European Union is skewed towards the overrepresentation of small states, and small states disproportionately rely on the European Union for the vindication of their rights and vindication of their interests. I think the issue, and I speak here particularly because I am based in Ireland, the issue of solidarity is a crucial one, because the European Union, let's remind ourselves, does not defend itself. the Union does not defend its own member states. It has a mutual solidarity clause, but there are so many holes in that mutual solidarity clause to make it, effectively meaningless. And here I give, the very, very explicit example of Ireland and Brexit. When the UK withdrew from the European Union or said it was withdrawing from the European Union, Irish diplomats went around European capitals saying this was an existential national security threat. It threatened peace on the island of Ireland. It threatened the peace process on the island of Ireland. And we sought the protection and solidarity of our fellow EU member states. And we got it. And we got it in spades. And we got it at a price because many of the smaller member states, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, they paid a heavy economic price for the kind of Brexit we got. And we got that kind of Brexit because the European Union stood alongside Ireland in terms of its hour of need, in terms of a defense of its existential security interests. Now, the shoe's on the other foot. You look at Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, they are visibly and currently threatened by the Russian Federation. And the question, to my mind, and again, this is a parochial question perhaps for your audience, but it's important, I think, for an Irish audience. The important question is, well, does Ireland return that solidarity? If we see little green men in the streets of Riga, if we see Russian peacekeepers crossing borders, where then does solidarity come? Is Ireland going to send, thoughts, prayers, and blankets to Riga, or is it going to send whatever military capacity it has in defense of fellow EU member states? So I think that is a conversation that the Union has to have because, as I say, it does not yet have a common defense. But it's also a question for individual member states to think through, and not just Ireland, but Malta, Cyprus, Austria. There are other countries that need to think through what membership of the European Union means and what solidarity should mean.
Now, Brexit is an important point, and of course, of huge importance to Ireland, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland. I don't want to go there, but you did mention that, say, in relation to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, they ended up getting Brexit they might not have wanted, right, out of solidarity with Ireland. The world has changed. We established that with the Russian full-blown invasion of Ukraine. Is it also then the time to get over Brexit and for the EU to reconcile with the UK, even outside of the EU? It would be in their mutual interest, particularly when it comes to security.
Well, I agree with you, but I think the reconciliation comes from the other direction. The European Union, you look back at the negotiations, the European Union was not just willing, but was anxious to have a defense chapter in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That chapter was dismissed by Boris Johnson on coming into government. There are in London, there are many political forces that just want nothing to do and want, already say that the Brexit they have isn't Brexity enough. So if there's reconciliation to come, it has to come from the UK because, as I say, the door has been open on the European side for some time. Now, we do have this new institution, European Political Cooperation, this EPC structure, which I think at least in part, at least in terms of the logic that President Macron put forward for it, at least in part is a forum for the UK to pursue a relationship with the European Union, particularly in the area of security and defense. But again, what we've seen, and again, it comes back to London, the British are supposed to take the chair of this. They're meant to host the next meeting of this. And as of yet, they have been unwilling to schedule the next summit meeting of EPC. So genuinely, and I don't say this with any sort of anti-English or anti-British sentiment, if there's to be reconciliation, both parties need to be in the room. And as of now, the British do not wish to walk across that threshold. Now, I think the coming change of government in the UK will change things, I think, profoundly and fundamentally. And I think that is a real historic opportunity for both the European Union and the UK to sit in a room together and see what can be done, particularly in the area of defense and security.
So we have talked about EU, Ukraine, to that extent also about EU, Russia, EU and the United Kingdom. What's your view on the relationship between the EU and China, and which direction do you think it is moving, which direction it ought to be moving?
It's a fascinating one. Clearly the dynamic that the European Union is facing is the dynamic between Washington and Beijing. And so the European Union is a bit player, a marginal player in that particular drama, and is being pulled in two different directions. I think what the European Union would like to do would be to tread not so much a middle path, but a path which maintains open channels of communication and profitable relations with China, but which at the same time is acutely conscious of the security realities and situations that exist between China and some of its neighbors, and also the human rights situation within China. I personally don't think the European Union has done enough in terms of defense of human rights and defense of democracy, whether it's in Hong Kong or whether it's with respect to the Uyghurs in China or many other issues, and in particular, and indeed in terms of China's strategic relations with some of its neighbors like the Philippines or Vietnam. There are a lot of issues there that the European Union has spoken very softly about, if it has spoken at all. And I would like to see the European Union speak more loudly on this. But that also requires, as it does with Brexit, it requires reciprocity from Beijing. And I don't know that as of yet, there is any willingness or interest on the part of Beijing to develop the kind of relationship with the European Union, which would not only defend and protect Chinese sovereignty, which clearly is absolutely paramount for the Chinese government, but would also acknowledge the fact that there are genuine differences between the EU and China on some of these issues, and that China too has to move. And I think there's an element of reluctance on the Chinese part. I think if the Chinese government gave any indication to the European Union that there was any movement on issues of democracy, human rights, strategic relations with some of China's neighbors, I think it would find an open-armed partner to try and pursue that. Because I don't think fundamentally, I don't think the European Union wants necessarily just to follow the United States into a confrontation with China. I don't know that that's in the US's interest. It certainly isn't in China's interest. So I think the European Union is there and available as a partner. It's a question in my mind as to whether or not China chooses to take up that offer.
Professor Tonra, thank you for your time. Thank you.
Great pleasure, Stefan. Thank you.